So, hello and welcome back to the end, which is kind of insane. We've made it all the way to the final chapter of the final book in the Enduring Flame trilogy, it's like the end of an era, because wow, it feels like it's been a very long journey. Um, and we're finally here. I feel like I should be playing The Doors' The End in the background or something. Except, that would probably immediately get this video like tinged for copyright or something like that. So we won't do that, but just play The Doors in the background. And yeah, we left the last chapter on quite the cliffhanger. We left it with Tercel finally telling Harrier exactly what the Fire Crown had told him. Harrier finally telling Tercel exactly what the price of his spell to find out that Ankeldar was still alive was, and with Anirin evidently summoning or somehow making every single person that they had left behind for safety in Abiyabadashar be where they are, which probably is not a good thing. This sounds terrible. At least it did not say at the end of the last chapter that they looked like they were shamblers, so hopefully they're all still alive, but that's not cool. And we're at the end, so we have a lot of loose threads that we need to wrap up and do it in a chapter, which seems like an impossible task because there are a lot of loose threads here. Anyway, it is time for us to jump back in one last time to the Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And that is with chapter 20, which is titled Bones in the Desert. That's an ominous chapter title, not gonna lie. I mean, not that the chapter titles always have much to do with what happens in the chapter, but that's a very ominous chapter title. And I will be reading ginormous chunks from this because obviously it's the final chapter. We have a lot to wrap up. But it starts with Harrier and Tercel turning and looking at the fact that they can see Anirin just still sitting there. And they can see all of the people from Abiyabadashar. And they figure she must have somehow made them come to her. And Tercel points over and begins what he's probably thinking is his final attempt at persuading Harrier to let him toss himself into the lake of fire. There she is, said Tercel savagely. Right over there with her dark spawn army, and all I have to do to stop her is die. I've always known I was going to have to die for this. You have too. He heard Harrier drag in a long, shuddering breath. Yes. Be quick. Tercel nodded and closed his eyes. I do this freely and by my own will. I choose this. He took a step towards the crushing heat. And suddenly, the crippling absence in his mind was filled between one heartbeat and the next. Ankeldar? He shouted inside his mind. Bonded, I am here. I am here. Tercel felt the roiling turmoil in Ankeldar's mind. To be in the depths of Abiyabadashar one moment and then a heartbeat later falling through the open sky, From Tersel's thoughts, Ankildar took the knowledge of how much time had passed. For Ankildar, it had only been an instant, stepping onto the stone of the 10th descent, a flash of light, then falling through the sky. The confused, desperate scramble to spread his wings and fly, casting about frantically for his bonded. For Tersel, it had been more than half a year. Alone, crippled, incomplete, grieving, lost. He could feel Ankildar's bewilderment, determination, anger, as if they were his own emotions, and mixed through them, mirrored in Ankildar's mind, and returned to his the incredulous joy that he felt to be reunited with what he had thought lost to him forever. He knew he had started crying, but the heat of the lake of fire dried his tears as soon as they formed. He had wanted this for so long. Memories of Ankildar had been what he had clung to when everything else had hurt too much to think about. Memories of stolen joy and friendships in the depths of the horror and despair. Now Ankildar was flying west as fast as he could. He knew that he was somewhere in the east, so far distant that in all of his centuries of life he had never been here, but it didn't matter how quickly Ankildar flew towards Telinchital, he would never reach it. Tersel would be dead in a few minutes, and Ankildar would die with him. He felt Ankildar's love enfold him for what would be the last time. Yes, bonded. Yes. This is the end we were meant to have, you and I. Tersel took another step towards the edge of the platform. Oh, Lightno, please, he heard Harrier say. The anguish in Harrier's voice made Tersel turn, made him look, because Tersel knew that Harrier had made his unhappy peace with this sacrifice, and he wouldn't protest it. But when Tersel looked back over the desert, he saw that the black dogs were running towards the spellbound Isvani, who were still trudging obliviously up the Dove Road. Xanatar and the warband were on their way towards them. They had seen the column of Aniran's helpless victims when Aniran had dropped her spells of concealment, the same as Tersel and Harrier had, but even with their head start, Xanatar's riders would not reach the Isvani before the black dogs did. All they could do was die with them. It was reflex. Stupid feudal reflex that made Tersel encircle the pack with a wall of mage shield. It would only hold till he died, and now Harrier would know. Ankildar, said Harrier, almost as if he were praying. He came back. He turned and began walking towards the lake of fire, his face set. Tersel grabbed him. No, he shouted. Harrier, it won't work. You can't. The Fire Crown sacrifice has to be a dragon-bound mage. Harrier struggled to get loose, well, not throwing both of them into the Tuchuko. Tersel didn't want to hope that Ankildar's return meant now he and Bisochim could destroy Aniran the way the ancient mages had destroyed the Indarkin, because what if he was wrong? If they failed, he didn't think the Fire Crown would give him a second chance to fulfill the bargain. And he didn't think he could nerve himself to do this a second time. He was working so hard to hold on to Harrier, to hold the spell that was penning the black dogs in place as long as he could. He missed the moment when Bisochim climbed the last of the steps to the platform. No, wait, no, don't, cried Tersel. Ankildar came back. You saw, we can stop her without this. He tried to get to Bisochim, but now it was Harrier who wasn't letting go of him. Don't, Tersel shouted. But Bisochim ignored him. He walked without hesitation to the edge of the platform. Then he turned to look back towards the staircase where Saravase stood. She raised her head proudly. "Yes," she cried. "Beloved." Bisochim turned and flung himself from the lip of the platform. "A dragon-bound mage. One who goes willingly," Tercel whispered, his voice thick with tears. That, I think, is a very satisfying and quite emotional, like, I was going to say paragraph, but that was several paragraphs. And yeah, Ankeldar's back, and Bisochim just flung himself into the heart of a volcano, which sounds absolutely horrifying and amazing, but I mean, let's be fair, it's what he's been wanting for a very long time. But as you can see, we have a lot of book left, so now we have to worry that maybe the Fire Crown's not going to honor his bargain. But we will have to jump back in and see what happens next. We're going into Harrier's perspective for at least a few minutes. From the moment he had found out that the Lake of Fire was back at Telenchital, Harrier had suspected that somebody was going to get thrown into it, and he doubted it would be an Iron. He had known all along that Tercel knew more about this bargain he had made than he was saying, and Harrier had suspected that the payment for the Fire Crown's cooperation was going to be Tercel's life and Bisochim's. He knew more about the great powers than Tercel thought he did. Wasn't the great ocean a great power? The final and greatest? And he knew that the great powers were cruel and merciless and always hungry. Bisochim had woken the Fire Crown up, and Tercel had asked for its help, and the Fire Crown would exact payment. It wouldn't be fair to Saravase, but she'd be joining about 90,000 other people who hadn't gotten a lot of nicety or fairness recently. What Harrier had been most afraid of in the long Sen nights between then and this day was that what Tercel meant to do here wouldn't work. Because if he and Bisochim did it, and it didn't work, then Harrier would be the only mage left in the Izvai, and he wasn't sure that he could hold out against an Iron all by himself. He had hated the relief that he felt when he found out the Fire Crown's sacrifice only had to be Tercel, but it hadn't been much relief. Kerta had warned him moon turns ago that his mage price would be heavy. He had been waiting a long time to pay it, and when he stood at the top of the wall and seen the fire in the distance long ago at the oasis, he had known that he would pay it at the Lake of Fire. He had always known that paying it meant giving up the one thing he most valued in all the world. But in the long Sen nights since he had taken up the 3 books, he had come to love and hate and fear and trust the wild magic. The wild magic had let Bisochim kill all the other wild mages in the desert as part of its unknowable purpose. So what was it going to ask him to do? When he had seen the bespelled Izvani people, Harrier had felt the crushing sense of warning that meant that his time to pay his mage price had come, but he still didn't know what it was. Then Tercel had cast his spell, a big one. No mage light, not fire, and Harrier had suddenly realized that Ankeldar was back. He saw Tercel hesitate at the edge of the Techuco, and nobody wanted to die, especially not by jumping into a lake of liquid rock, but somebody had to, and maybe the Fire Crown would take him, even if Harrier didn't have a dragon. Only when Tercel dragged him back, shouting at him that he wasn't good enough, and Harrier wondered in horror whether what he was going to have to do was pull both of them into the fire, that the fine points of his mage price were suddenly revealed. You must bond with a dragon. Harrier didn't know where he could get a dragon, let alone how bonding with one equaled giving up what he most valued, and he knew if somebody didn't go over the edge of the Tichuco right now, Anirin was going to not only wipe out the last of the Izvi, but them as well, when suddenly it just didn't matter. Bisochim made the sacrifice, and Saravase was alone. Harrier had always thought that dragons vanished the moment their bondmates died, or at least had died. On the other hand, Anirin had sent one of her Balwarta towards the top of the Lake of Fire when Bisochim had started up the steps, and Harrier was staring right at it, and it was hanging motionless in the air, and its wings weren't moving at all. Time had stopped. Then suddenly its wings flapped down, and Harrier could feel Tercel gripping his arms, and having a dragon, especially one who hated him, was really going to suck. But paying his mage price meant that Saravase didn't have to die too, and he was tired of everybody around him dying. He tried to pull away from Tercel to get to Saravase, but Tercel wouldn't let go of him. The pressure of his unpaid mage price was crushing him to the point that Harrier thought he might die when Saravase did, and then suddenly he wasn't thinking of anything at all. So Harrier's mage price is to bond with a dragon, and somehow that equates to giving up the thing that he values most in the entire world. Okay. What do we know about Harrier? We know that Harrier values his friends. We know that he also deeply values his kind of new and budding love with Shariah, but there is something that Harrier values even more than that, and that's what he's being asked to give up by bonding with a dragon. Let's read some more. Back into Tercel's viewpoint for a little bit. We're just flipping back and forth, left and right. This was why he had been born a high mage. This was why the wild magic had sent him to the elven cities and given him Ankeldar. This was why it had made Harrier into a night mage. This was why he and Harrier and Ankeldar had been sent to Abiyabadashar, why Ankeldar had been taken from him, why Ankeldar had been returned, how and when he had, and even why Anirin had set her trap on Saravase. It was all for this moment. In Abiyabadashar, Bisochim had told Tercel about the moment of three becoming one. A prophecy that couldn't be fulfilled until a form of magic unknown in the great queen Veselar Farkanon's time entered the world. High magic. Tercel's magic. Ankeldar had prepared Tercel to fight a demon. Ankeldar had prepared him to seek every possible advantage in battle, even listening to whatever unguarded thoughts his enemy might have. The curse and the glory of high magic was that it could be used for anything. Light, dark, good, evil meant nothing to a magic that was nothing more than a machine in the hands of men. The spell to be that Harrier radiated sent waves of nausea through Tercel, but he steeled himself against it as he would have forced himself into battle with an iron. Tercel plunged himself into Harrier's magic and cast a spell of his own on Harrier. He wasn't a wild mage who needed to ask permission of those he bespelled, and in that single moment, Tercel understood the terrible power and temptation of high magic, and why the ancient high mages had been so feared and hated. He could not promise that he would always or ever ask permission to cast his spells, but he would always understand the terrible responsibility that the freedom carried. Now, Tercel could feel the full weight of Harrier's mage price as if it were lightning gathering itself to strike. The raw touch of the wild magic filled Tercel's mouth with bile, but in that instant he knew everything that Harrier did about his mage price. And he knew things that Harrier didn't. He knew that whether Harrier wanted to or not, he was about to bond with a dragon. He knew that the wild magic would allow Harrier to offer Saravase the bond, but that Saravase would reject the bond that Harrier offered. She was injured, grief-stricken, spell-trapped by an iron, and she would refuse, and the last precious seconds of her life would trickle out, and the magic that was all she would be unbound. And to pay his mage price, Harrier had to bond now. He could force Saravase into a bond against her will, or he could refuse to pay his mage price, and to do either would destroy him as a wild mage. But there was another way. There was another dragon. Ankildar had already changed bonds once, just as the ancient elven dragons had. He wasn't injured, and he wouldn't be giving up Tercel to do it. That was what the prophecy meant. 3 become 1. It could work because the bond formed between dragon and mage through magic itself, or the possibility of it, and the high magic and wild magic were all different in every way that there possibly was. They could do this. High mage and night mage and dragon together. It was time. At long last. "Are you ready?" Tercel asked. Ankildar didn't need to be there in order to bond with Harrier, since Tercel was. "It will be interesting, bonded," Ankildar replied. Tercel laughed wordlessly and cast the second spell that swept the imminence of Harrier's mage price into the dragon bond with him and Ankildar. And 3 became 1. Tercel remembered the moment he had bonded with Ankildar, but Ankildar's was an ancient, disciplined mind. Ankildar had lived as half a dragon bond for a millennium before he had bonded with Tercel, and from the moment Tannerite the White had made her pact and the first dragon had been born, all dragons had been meant to bond. Harrier's mind was a place of rage and confusion. He had only the vaguest understanding of magic as Tercel knew it, and he only knew it as something to be used to attack. Linking to Harrier's mind was like flying into a sandwind naked. In the first instant of bonding, Tercel felt Harrier's shock as the spell hit him, his futile attempt to form some sort of a defense against what he knew was magic and what he thought must be a demon attack. His realization that it was a dragon bond, and his wild struggle to reach out to Saravase instead. Then his furious surrender to the wild magic, and the seal of the mage price paid, and all the times that Harrier had spoken of paying mage price, he had made it sound like a transaction that was over and done with. But in the moment of the fusion, Tercel understood that when you paid a mage price, it changed you forever. It was a thing that was never finished. It wasn't like a spell of the high magic that could be done and forgotten. He felt the moment when Harrier realized what he had done, and mixed with Harrier's incredulous joy at the dragon bound, as the friendship Harrier had shared with Enkeldar became something infinitely deeper, he could feel Harrier's outrage. Not with Tercel. Tercel understood that in an instant, but with the wild magic itself. Tercel grasped at the same time Harrier did, in the moment of Harrier's mutinous surrender, that his mage price was not to bond with the dragon, but to bond in this triplicate fusion of mind, memory, magic, and will, paying the mage price of an ancient elven queen, and in doing that, surrender his freedom and his solitude and his autonomy forever. And in Harrier's acceptance of his mage price, paid not gladly but willingly, the way that Tercel had meant to honor his bargain with the Fire Crown, Tercel felt Harrier's grief in knowing that Tercel would always blame himself for Bisochim's death. It was a perfect union, not only of high magic and wild magic, but of minds as well, in that one timeless moment of awareness and joining, not only with Enkeldar, but with each other. The two young mages each realized something neither had known till that very moment. "You've been doing this magic stuff all wrong," Harrier said. "No, you have," Tercel answered. From the moment he had realized that he was a high mage, Tercel had assumed that he had been given his magery in order to fight a war against the darkness. But when the war magic became the high magic, a millennium before, it had expanded beyond the art of war. Though never a magic of the natural world, it had still been used for healing, for the diagnosis of ills, for the discovery of new knowledge, to uncover hidden truths. Tercel's true strength lay in building, not destruction, identifying problems in order to solve them through peace, not war. And Harrier was a night mage, and so he had believed that he had to use his night mage gifts to fight wars and kill people. He could, if he needed to, but his greatest skill, his greatest strength, lay in analyzing things. He could improve a city's defenses, but that was because he wanted to make them work better. He could do the same thing to a flour mill if someone asked him. "You mean that both of us are supposed to make everybody happy and healthy?" Harrier demanded. "Sure," Tercel thought. "I'll tell them that they don't need to argue with each other, and you fix the underlying problems." "Won't work here," Harrier thought. "I have an idea," thought Tercel. That would be, I'm not gonna lie, that I have to agree with Harrier here, that the whole being able to hear everybody and your best friend suddenly being able to hear your thoughts and know everything that you're thinking, I think that might be his true mage price, because that would drive me crazy. I don't want people to know what I am thinking. Sometimes I don't even want to know what I'm thinking. That would be terrible. But it does let them perfectly understand each other, and so they turn themselves towards Saravase in those microseconds before she's going to disappear because her bonded did. Healing spells weren't a part of the high magic, but they were a part of the wild magic, and by now Harrier knew them well. He ran to the staircase, plunging down it, past Shariah, past Saravase's head, halfway along the length of her neck, where it lay stretched at full length on the staircase. He placed both his hands against her neck, Ankildar's near infinite power was Harrier's to draw on, and Tercell's skill showed him how. Nothing like this had ever been done. Not back in the ancient days or in all the centuries after. To keep the severed half of a bonded pair alive simply by pouring healing energy into it shouldn't have worked. It could have never worked if Tercel had not spent days of horror holding his mage shield around the walls of Tarnatha Atreyu when every bone and muscle in his body had cried out for him to quit and surrender. It could never have worked if Harrier had not spent moon turns in the Isvai, pushing his body and mind to their limit every day and night to keep the Isvani alive by nothing more than his determination that they were not going to die. Neither of them had given up. Not then, not now, not once in the thousands of battles that had brought them to this day. And so it worked. The makeshift bandage on the stub of Saravasse's mutilated wing ripped free as the wing grew back in a heartbeat. Harrier heard Shariah gasp in surprise and horror because she knew that by casting a spell on Saravasse, Harrier had just opened his mind to Aniran, but Harrier couldn't spare any of his concentration to explain what was happening. He might have been dead in the next moment by Shariah's hand, but Shariah was forced to throw herself flat on the stairs as Saravasse screamed in displeasure and beat her wings furiously like a very large angry chicken. Before Saravasse could either take to the air or bite him, Harrier sat on her neck and held on. He hissed with pain as Aniran seized that opportunity that he had given her to thrust her way into his mind. But it wasn't his mind alone any longer. It was his and Tercell's and Ankildar. And a wild mage and a high mage together could kill a demon. Light and dark, life and death, pain and pleasure, sickness and health, knowledge and ignorance, famine and bounty, fire and ice, ocean and desert, summer and winter, all opposites, but all contained within the wild magic because the wild magic was a magic of balance. It was the balance, the great balance. The Endarkened, the demons, what they were, what they wanted, what they served, were the opposite of all those things at once. The peoples of light called them darkness and shadow, but those were names bestowed out of fear from their own child times when they had been small, soft, helpless creatures that feared the night. The demon's true name was void, absence, lack. That was why the presence of Aniran and its kind, it was no more female than a rock, caused all those sealed to the 3 books absolute agony. The wild magic was the sum of all that was. Its wild mages were charged by it with the great work of being its living eyes, minds, and hands. The absence and opposite of all they knew and served was an assault on all their senses at once. In the depths, out of a desperate war, Void had driven too many of them mad, and they had embraced it. Those who had seen that happen without the true knowledge of the enemy they fought spoke of wild mages falling to the dark. And so, in desperation, the war magic had been born. It was a magic that sealed itself off from the world, from the wild magic, from the ancient music of trees and stars, and sealed itself from the great balance itself. The war magic was a thing of rules and procedures and carefully calculated formulas, for its mages were insensible to the instincts that would let them hear their mage prices and reckon the spell cost. But neither could they sense the void. The magic of balance and the magic of laws diverged quickly, for the war mages crafted spells that no wild mage could. But in the blending of the two, the void would find not death, but unmaking. So I like that we get in this little bit a final actual explanation of the three kinds of magic in the universe. You've got the wild magic, which is everything. It's full on life, and high magic, which is rules and everything, and the void, which has always been called dark magic, but is actually just absence magic. It's interesting. It's an interesting magic system, and I kind of like it. I don't know that I would like being a mage. In fact, I'm pretty sure I would probably hate it, any of the magic systems, but I do like that we finally, in the very last chapter of the final book, get a little bit more explanation about it. Back into it. And back into Harrier's mind. I always have to figure out which perspective we are coming from. When he remembered the brief, terrible battle later, Harrier was able to put the events into their proper order. This, then this, then this. But even with Ankildar's help, he was never sure which parts he did and which parts were Tercell's. Lightning crackled out of a cloudless sky, the bolts searing down with absolute precision, slamming a dozen bulwarta to the desert. The wall of mage shield that Tercell had cast around the black dogs blinked out and reformed in an instant to encircle Anirin and her entire Ashtaban army, trapping them inside. It was only to protect the Isvani while the actual fight was going on, since Anirin was already out. The battleground was actually in their minds, his and Tercell's. And oh, light and darkness. He had managed to go 15 entire years thinking that Tercell didn't have a temper. He couldn't imagine being that angry, and still thinking in that cold, calculating way, because Tercell was angry, and Harrier could feel it. You can let her through, Harrier. I'm ready for her. It was only then that Harrier realized he had been holding out against Anirin with all his strength while she had pried and picked and battered at his mind, taunting him and drowning him in foulness. He let go, like a drowning man slipping below the water, and Ankildar's mind gathered him into safety. He felt Anirin's mind brush past his, thinking that she was claiming him, thinking that she had won, to run right into Tercell's. You don't get to do this to me. You don't get to do this to my friends. You don't get to do this to my world. I reject you. I deny you. You are not. It was like watching something being folded up in every direction at once, although that wasn't possible. And Harrier wasn't actually watching anything at all. Tercell was putting everything he had into doing whatever he was doing to Anirin, and Harrier was doing everything else that needed to be done. If he stopped healing Saravase, even for an instant, Saravase would just stop. If he let the mage shield drop, the sandwalkers and black dogs would reach the Dove Road and the Isvai there in an instant. He would remember later, when there was the leisure for things like remembering, that Mage Shield wasn't his spell to cast, and even if it were, he hadn't cast it. And later still, it would occur to him to be grateful that stubbornness was the defining quality of a night mage. But for now, his eyes were closed, and his face was pressed against the hot scales of Saravase's neck, and even so, he could see that every living creature of Anirin's inside the mage shield was going mad. The Sandwalkers tried to tunnel their way out of their prison, but the shield that had been cast below the desert as well as around it. They turned on each other and on the black dogs as well. They cut the shamblers, the only things that were unaffected by the frenzied need to escape, into little pieces. At the same time that Harrier was holding Maid's shield against all attacks, he was pouring torrents of healing into Saravase, since the only reason Saravase still hadn't gone wherever abruptly unbonded dragons went was because he had never stopped healing her. Holding either spell in place by itself, Maid's shield or the healing, would have taken more concentration and strength than Harrier could ever have imagined having. He was just a channel, though, for Ankildar's power, but even doing that much made him feel as if he were being battered by an endless storm. There were 100 witnesses to the battle. The moment Tercel had first cast his Maid's shield against the black dogs, Xanatar's Isvani had stopped and stared in wonder. None of them said after that they had heard anything in those next moments other than Saravase's shrieks of rage and the howls of the black dogs. But Harrier and Tercel could both hear Aniron screaming. At first it was with fury. When it, began casting spells at Tercel, Harrier, and Saravase, the Isvani, and everything else, Tercel had just blocked them. Blocked the sound. He could have closed the Maid's shield completely, but if he had, he wouldn't be able to get inside it to the demon. And Harrier could feel that Tercel was doing something to Aniron, something complicated and powerful, requiring as much of his concentration as holding the spells was complex and powerful and hard to do for Harrier. Harrier didn't have enough attention to spare to wonder, and it would be deadly to Tercel's concentration if he were asked questions, but Harrier slowly realized that the dragon bond meant he didn't have to ask and wouldn't have to ask questions. He could tell what Tercel was doing. Tercel was forcing Aniron back through the door that it had tricked Bisochim into opening, and Tercel didn't care that the door was only meant to go one way, and he didn't care that the door was closed. He was using as much force as he needed to. The magic of a knight and wild mage combined with his to push Aniron back. When Aniron realized that Tercel could actually do that, it began to beg and bargain. At first, it did it just to cover an attempt at escape. When Aniron discovered that the Maid's shield extended below the ground as well as above, it began begging in earnest. The battle was almost over then. The air crackled with magic, power, and heat. Harrier could feel what Tercel was doing, and for a moment he felt a flash of panic that something was going to happen, not just to Aniron, but to everything in existence. The spells Tercel was weaving were complicated, alien, powerful, and then it was over. The shock of it, the spell's release, the sudden absence of Aniron, made Harrier lose his grip on the spells that he was holding. Dropping the Maid's shield didn't matter. There was nothing alive or moving inside. But he also lost control of the healing spell. Harrier could feel Saravase begin to become insubstantial. "No," said Tercel. "Get out of my head," Harrier demanded. "Let me help. I can fix it," Tercel insisted. "Fix it fast, 'cause I need to puke." Now that he wasn't forcing himself to concentrate, the fact that he had been wallowing in the void for however long it had been, a minute, a year, caught up all at once. Tercel pushed the healing spell back into place. It felt as if someone had put a package in Harrier's hands and told him, "Deliver it, damn it." And then there was a something that made his brain tickle. Harrier sneezed and sneezed, then gagged. We're going to need to come up with new words, Tercel thought. He sounded giddy with joy. Ankeldar's return, Aniran's destruction. But that'll hold. Till we can find Saravase a bondmate anyway. And that is not the end, but that is the end of Aniran. And I can't decide if, to me, it felt too short or just perfect. Kind of like this book, I'm never sure what I think of the way it the way the demon ends. Although, to be fair, the other in the Obsidian trilogy, it was quite the abrupt ending as well. I mean, Idalia sacrificed herself, and then Germain stabbed Sevilla, the demon queen. Anyway, I'm going to grab a drink, and we are going to finish everything up. We don't have much left. It's mostly reconstruction. But yay, Aniran is dead, and now we just need to wrap up the final loose ends. So give me a minute. I'll be right back. And yeah, we're going to do this. All right, so demon defeated, possibly forever. A entirely new way of bonding formed with a high mage, a wild mage, and a dragon, which somehow will stop dragons from dying. We'll have to figure all of that out as we do the wrap-up, which is quite long as well. After it's all over, Harrier is like, what are you so happy about, Tercel? And Tercel's like, we won? Duh. Shariah is very confused. And Harrier opens his eyes and looks over, and he's like, look, we won. And Shariah's like, okay, yeah, I kind of figured that, since all of Aniran's creations are suddenly dead, and all of our people are still there, but we've got work to do. And so Harrier and Shariah go down towards all of the people that were forced to march from Abiyabadashar and find out their story. They had been rousted out of their tents this morning, Harrier thought, by a demon and its army, and 4 hours later, it wasn't even mid-morning, Aniran was dead and they had won. Harrier had spent most of the last year thinking, oh light, what now? And he had never dared to think, what next? It hardly seemed as if it could be the same day. In just a few hours, Harrier had gone from expecting to die, to believing that Tercel would die, to not knowing how many other people were going to have to die as well, to suddenly knowing that they had won decisively and completely, and being bonded to Ankeldar and Tercel as well. He still wasn't sure how that was going to work out, but he didn't have to know, because suddenly the fate of the world no longer depended on whether or not Harrier could just make things work. So they go down and find out what happened, like I said, to the people at Abiyabadashar. Harrier might have been right that Aniran wasn't able to locate the city by magic. They would never know for sure now, but Aniran hadn't needed to. There had been other ways for it to discover the city's location, from Vianas Palakun's mines to being told of it by any of the Azvani it had captured, and once it had gotten there, well, a demon's spells were more powerful even than a dragon-bound mage's. Liafa and Marap and Kamar and Helifan Parazel, the magistrate, everybody that Harrier asked, all said the same thing. Everyone in Abiyabadashar had felt restless from the very moment the war party had left, And as the hours trickled by, first the young children couldn't be found, and then the children that searched for them didn't return. And then the Aculus hounds vanished, and then the adults that searched for all of them brought word that all of the animals from the garden level, including all of the Shotars, had also vanished. And anyone that went out onto the surface of the desert began walking towards the Dove Road and the Lake of Fire and found themselves unable to turn back. And they had just marched and ended up where they ended up. Some of them, thankfully, were able to realize what was happening and had grabbed at least some water, some tents, some food. But yeah, they had just marched, and they're in pretty rough shape because they didn't have all the preparations, but they're alive, which is good. And it gives Tercel a little bit of satisfaction and joy because suddenly he has his magic again. And everyone who had gone for so long, dismissing Tercel as only having minor spells, most of them not even aware that Tercel was responsible for the globes of light that had lit up everything, but suddenly Tercel's doing magic and feeling amazing. And Harrier worries a little bit because suddenly Tercel goes from being called the Northern Mage without any magic to doing all of these incredible spells, like turning the desert into water instead of calling water up the way Harrier would have to and things like that. And Harrier's like, it's kind of a bad thing that there are no checks on the high magic. And Keldar pops into Harrier's mind to say, no, there's you and me, Harrier. We're checks. And Harrier's like, yeah, that's great. Wonderful. But we have work to do. And Harrier begins, healing all of the people. It was a disorienting sensation to heal without counting the cost or hearing the voice of wild magic setting out a spell price. And it didn't matter to Harrier that he was never again going to have to worry about being asked to pay a spell cost or seek out people willing to pay the spell price with him. It didn't matter to Harrier that his bondage power was his freely without asking. Harrier asked. Permission of those he healed. Permission of Ankeldar to draw upon the freely given gift. It would be far too easy to think that this was something he had a right to otherwise. So it's interesting that Tercel is having a wonderful time just doing magic freely, and Harrier is still asking. It's kind of good. It kind of also shows the different approaches, because Tercel, having been born a high mage, has never had to deal with that. And Harrier definitely has. Harrier also tells Ankeldar, who this entire time is still somewhere far, far away, to please stop in the Elven lands and grab up some Elven mages, because even with all of Ankeldar's power to draw on, they have a lot of things that still need to be done. And it's going to be more than Harrier and Tercel can do by themselves. And Harrier is stunned by the fact that after spending so many moon turns complaining about how elves never did anything soon enough, both Harrier and Tercel were amazed at how fast they could act when they actually wanted to. Against all of Harrier's expectations, the Elven Queen actually had meant immediately when she said she was sending help to Ankeldar immediately. Less than an hour after Ankeldar got there, the sky over Tel and Chittel was filled with dragons from the elven lands. Harrier was happy to let the elves take charge of the enormous task of feeding and sheltering and healing thousands of people. Now, dragons in every possible color basked on the stone at the foot of Tel and Chittel and along the steps leading to the Lake of Fire, and the desert was filled with enormous flower-bright elven pavilions, enough to hold all the refugees and half the livestock. Harrier found it disconcerting that tents made of fabric so thin he could see shadows through them managed to be cool on the inside while it was still the same old Dereleth on the outside. Shariah didn't like them at all, and Harrier found himself pressed into service once again, reassuring the Isvani people that the arrival of the elder kin was not just a preamble to some new disaster. It was late in the afternoon before the immediate needs of Aniran's last victims were dealt with every last person and animal fed, healed, and sheltered, and Harrier was just looking for some place to lie down and rest when Ankeldar told him that he and Tercel had been summoned to an audience with Valandriel Elven Queen. So, poof, elves suddenly arrived and fixing everything with their magic, which does feel almost too rushed, but then again, I think anything that's going to finish this is going to feel too rushed because we spent such a long time getting here. Harrier felt as if he ought to wipe his boots before stepping onto the carpet inside the royal pavilion, but there wasn't any place to wipe them, and the only thing on his boots was dust anyway. He shivered when he walked inside, and once again the temperature dropped. Maybe Shariah had a point. Maybe it was all a little bit too strange. Harrier didn't want to be here. Tercel had apparently found time not only to take a bath and shave sometime in the last few hours, but to get some new clothes. They were all in shades of cream and sand and gold, a tunic and leggings and boots and long sleeveless vest and a glittering complicated sash. Seeing Tercel in an elven outfit looked odd after so many moon turns of seeing him wearing the same filthy, tattered desert robes that Harrier was now wearing, and it just reminded Harrier sharply of how bad he must look. His once blue wild mage robes were faded and ragged, grimy with dirt and ash and black rain and blood. He had most of a year's growth of beard on his face, and the last thing that he had even had that had halfway resembled a bath had been an ice cold, without soap, just rinsing salt and ash off of his skin in water back in Abiyabadashar. So Harrier's feeling quite grimy as he walks up to Valandriel Elven Queen, the daughter of Sandalan, who looks at Harrier and Tercel and says, "All of the people of light owe you, both of you, more than any of us can ever repay. But it is the elves who will discharge the debt, and so I say to you, ask what you will of us to the end of your lives and your children's lives and your children's children's, and it shall be granted to the last measure of our ability. I so pledge the word and honor of the house of Carolithian in witness of my oath." Tercel blinked slowly a few times. Harrier didn't think that this was the time to mention that they were probably going to be calling on that pledge before the morning was up. The Isvai was the Isvani's home, but right now there was not one plant, one oasis, one animal anywhere in it, unless there were still something left back at the last oasis. The tribes had never been completely self-sufficient either. Some had traded with the Atreyu cities, and those that hadn't traded with the ones that did. Even the Nalzindar wore cloth woven on city looms. But now the Atreyu cities were gone, and with them the trade in spice and medicine and textiles and rugs that had gone north were also gone. It would take more magic than that was possessed by two half-trained mages, even with a dragon bond, to remake the entire desert. The Elven Queen went on. And you, Harrier Gillian, once of Arameth, your gift to us was the greatest of all. Tercel has told us of how you accepted the 3 books from Shulkin's daughter so that you could aid him on his journey at such a great cost to yourself. Harrier was so busy trying to reconcile Shulkin's daughter with Kerta and wondering if the Landriel Elven Queen meant the Shulkin, and thinking in a horrified way that she did, that he almost missed the moment when Valandriel Elven Queen held out her hands to him. He started to recoil, started to stumble through a long explanation of how he hadn't done anything, and if he hadn't done it for the elves, or a bunch of people of the light that he had never met, when he felt a sharp kick to the ankle. He looked sideways. Tercel looked totally innocent. He had learned exactly how much that innocent act was really worth, though. So Harrier shrugged a little and took the last few steps that he needed to clasp the hands of the Queen of the Elves. They were slender and smooth and pale and jeweled, and Harrier thought of Shariah's hands, blunt and brown and strong and calloused, and he knew which ones he preferred. Tercel has told me that it is now the time of 3 becoming 1. Tarante the White's prophecy has been fulfilled, and you have done this through your accepting a bond with Ankeldar, she said. Before Harrier could stop her, she raised his hands and actually kissed them. He barely managed to keep from yelping. Know that my joy, and the joy of all elven kind, is beyond words, she said. Know that, for this reason above all, the claim of the House of Gillian upon the House of Caralathian will endure as long as leaf and star. Harrier was suddenly far colder than the helpful elf magery could account for. He hadn't learned a lot about elves during his brief visit to their lands, but he had learned enough to know that this was their most binding oath. As long as Valandriel Elven Queen had descendants, or her brothers and sisters, or anyone related to her had descendants, and he, or Jens, or Brelt, or Geralt, or probably even all of his cousins, both the Gillians and the ones on his mother's side had descendants, his descendants could ask hers for things, and they would have to give them to them. That was what House of meant, and that was what for as long as leaf and star endures meant. You've honored me far beyond what I deserve, he said. I will live my entire life trying to be worthy of it. You are worthy already, said Valandriel Elven Queen, but I will not keep you. Your labors have been long, and now is a time for rejoicing. Which Tercel points out is the Elven Queen's very polite way of saying, you stink, go take a bath. Which Harrier promptly does. And there's only one thing that's sort of kind of bringing them down, because what Harrier has done is basically made it so all dragons can just pass this triplicate bond. So they have to find some more high mages at this point, but basically dragons no longer have to die when their bondeds do. And speaking of dragons in need of bondage, Saravase is still there lamenting her lost bonded. Tercel, as we shift back into his perspective, leaves Harrier in the bathtub, thinking, how odd it is to be bonded to Harrier. Leaving Harrier to his own devices, there wasn't much trouble you could get into in a bathhouse. Harrier or Tercel walked back to the tents. Ankeldar's presence, a comforting weight in his mind, and below that, like a constant irritating grumble of thunder, was Harrier. He wondered what he sounded like to Harrier. Was it just as irritating? That will pass, Ankeldar said. Light, I hope so, said Tercel. But how do you know? Not all bondings are comfortable, even if they are irresistible. Good to know, said Tercel. It was a little daunting to think about living for years and decades, getting as old as Leofa, and someday having to accept a wild mage that wasn't Harrier into the dragon bond, since Harrier would be gone. Of course, maybe it would be Harrier that would have to find a new high mage. Tercel felt sympathy for whoever that person was. That day is far away, Ankeldar said. Of course, Tercel thought, Ankeldar might die. Dragons were immortal, but they weren't invulnerable. If that happens, Bonded, both of you will die at the same time. Okay, we'll skip that then, said Tercel. And he goes off looking at what needs to be done. He also is amazed and thinks and reflects a little bit about the fact that everybody that left Abiavadashar actually made it. Like, nobody died on the forced march that Aniran put them through. So Harrier's brother and everybody is still there. And he goes to the big party that the elves have set up. And he sits and he talks with Magistrate Parazel and Harrier's brother and his friend Cave, who has kind of looks a little bit furtive. Cave says, I don't want to go back to Arameth. I want to stay here and fix the desert. Because you can't make just buried roots grow. They rotted in all the rain. And do you have any idea how much work it's going to do to turn this desert back into a desert? Cave is actually adopted by Leofa's tribe and is going to stay for the rest of his life in the desert and work on fixing it, which is a good thing. The balance of nature was definitely thrown off there. But Magistrate Parazel and Harrier's brother are definitely going back to Arameth. And Harrier comes out of the bathhouse dressed in, thankfully for him, just blue wild mage robes. He doesn't actually want to be dressed in anything other than his Vani garb anymore. But he comes out, and when he came out, he saw that two of the dragons, a red one that wasn't Saravase and another that was sort of an in-between color, he couldn't quite decide if it was gray or lilac, were there. And Harrier's brother yells, Harrier, why are you dressed like that? Dad's gonna have cat fits. And you haven't shaved. Come on, we gotta go. The elves say that they'll take us back to the city. Harrier turned at the sound of the voice, but it took him a moment to recognize his brother. Like Tercel, Eugens had bathed and shaved and dressed in the elven style, but Eugens was wearing shades of green and tan and russet. No Chadar, of course, and Harrier realized with a pang of sorrow that he could see bright threads of silver in Eugens' hair that hadn't been there a year ago. For an instant, Harrier was tempted. Home, Arameth, his house on Grindon Road, and he could be home by supper. And his ma would cry over him, and his da would thump him on his back. And then he looked around. his eye passing over the bright pavilions of the elves till they settled on the homey, dun-colored tents of the Isvani. Arameth wasn't his home anymore. It wouldn't have been if he weren't dragon-bound, and it wouldn't have been if he weren't a wild mage. He had come too far to go back to what he had been, even if it was possible. "I'm not going, Jens," said Harrier. "I told you that, remember?" Eugens made a face and shook his head. "Look, Hare, I won't tell Ma that you're a wild mage. Just come home. Bring Shariah. Just for a visit." Harrier shook his head and held out his hand to his brother, and then turned to walk towards the waiting dragons. He knew that Eugens thought if he could get him to come home for a Sen night or two, the Sen nights would stretch into moon turns and he would never come back to the Isvai. "I have work to do," he said as they walked towards the dragons. "Here?" said Eugens. "It's a desert." "Yeah," said Harrier. "And it always will be, light be praised, but it needs to be a better desert than it is now." "How are you going to do that, Harrier?" said Eugens. "We'll think of something. Shariah and I will think of something. And Tercel and Ankildar and the wild magic, but you don't really need to know any of that, Jens, because I don't think you'd understand." And so Magistrate Parazel and Eugens head off back towards their old lives, which makes Harrier kind of happy about that. And he's also happy that Cave is staying and going to try to fix the desert. And it's starting to settle in on all of the Isvani people that they have time. That's great. They have a lot of work. It was understood that tomorrow would bring many things. The beginning of plans and understandings of how they must live now. The northerner who had come to live in the tents of the Nalzindar spoke many wise, hopeful words about restoring the Isvai to what it had once been, and he spoke to them in a way any man or woman might grasp. For nearly all upon whose ears his words fell had herded or hunted or gathered the desert's bounty into their hands, or even planted and harvested, and so they all knew when Cave Northerner spoke of bringing plants to the Isvai and leaving them to flourish, he was speaking of a work not to be completed in one wheel of the seasons, or even two, but 10, 20, maybe even more. If the Isvai must live as exiles until that work was done, it would be with the knowledge that their home would someday be restored to them, but for now, for tonight, there would be joy. And then we shift into Shariah's viewpoint as she has a little conversation with her uncle about Harrier and about what it means to love a wild mage, that, she can't really hold him forever. Although this is Harrier we're talking about. She might be thinking that she can't have him forever, but Harrier is from the north. She had never meant to love Harrier of the Two Swords, or to give him a place in her heart and spirit. He was of the cold north, and in so many ways a stranger. And she isn't sure what he feels. Which is one little tiny sort of bad thing that is in Shariah's mind right now. But it's okay. This is Harrier we're talking about. Speaking of Harrier, a half an hour after the celebration starts for the "We won!" Harrier remembered that he had always hated parties. The food was good. The drink was good. He had stayed away from the beer and the date wine, but there were a bunch of different fruit juices. It was the people that sucked. Dude, have to agree with Harrier. I'm not a party person. Not the people exactly. He had spent most of the last year trying to keep the Isvani alive, and he knew most of them personally by now. It was just, what they were saying and doing. A lot of them wanted to congratulate him on defeating an Iron, which just made him think about an Iron and realize that he couldn't actually explain what had happened. A lot of them wanted to kiss him. Leofa had managed it, and that was just embarrassing. Most of the people who didn't want to kiss him or congratulate him wanted to know what they should do next. Having spoken to Cave about his plans for the Isvi, Harrier actually had a pretty good idea now, but tonight wasn't the time to tell anybody, since the idea even creeped him out. Harrier thought that they should pick the least ruined of the far southern Atreyu cities and see if there were any desert plants alive there, grab them while they could, and farm and have flocks. Harrier didn't think that many of the tribes had much farming skills, but elves could farm and they could help. But avoiding that conversation was awkward. And the more times that he had or didn't have any of these conversations, the more Harrier realized that apparently the Isvani had managed to get the idea that he had always had a master plan for defeating an Iron. And despite the fact that this so-called master plan had gotten over half of them killed, they all seemed to think he was wonderful and they were eagerly awaiting his next stroke of genius. "It is in my mind that you should become High Umara of all the tribes," said Xanatar. Harrier had thought that he had found a nice dark corner to hide between the tents, but evidently Xanatar had found him. "It's in my mind that you're out of your mind," said Harrier. "Didn't you idiots try that already?" "Yes, but help me convince Harrier that I'm right," Xanatar yelled. A few moments later, to Harrier's horror, he had been chivied out of his hiding place and seated on a carpet. Well, everyone tried to convince him to become king of the Isvani. Harrier explains to them that that would be a very, very bad idea. Because if they had a king, then Chief Magistrate Vonel will send a commission of inquiry. And if they get here and they find a king, then they're going to lay all of the blame on that king. And wouldn't that be a terrible idea? And Harrier says, if you don't have a king, the king can't be forced to swear a consular oath. And if you can't figure out why that's good, I'm not wasting my time talking to you. Go celebrate, we won. Basically, Harrier's like, if you have a king, then you will become, the 10th city of the 9 cities of the north? Which means you guys will have to do all sorts of taxes and all sorts of counting and follow all of the laws of the north, which won't really work in the south. That's a terrible idea anyway. Shush, we win. And there really isn't too much left. Harrier and Shariah come to an understanding, which is always good. Earlier in the evening, someone had set a pair of lanterns on the bottom steps to the Lake of Fire. As Tercel and Harrier approached the steps, they saw Shariah sitting at the center of the bottom steps, staring into the night. Arameth wasn't even touched, Tercel said quietly to Harrier. The Isvi were almost wiped out. Harrier didn't need the dragon bond to know what Tercel was thinking. He had 16 years of knowing Tercel. Tercel was thinking, Shariah ought to hate us. "Instruction is the only gift freely given," Harrier quoted. "I don't tell you that all of the people that died wanted to, but they all died so that the Fire Crown could learn something." "Is that wild mage wisdom?" said Tercel. He sounded tired. The shock of victory and of reunion with Ankildar was starting to wear off. "No, I'm not that smart," said Harrier. "You're the one who told me that." At the sound of their voices, Shariah roused from her reverie and stood up. Tercel wants to go back to the top of Tel and Chital, said Harrier. He didn't have enough fun up there the last time. You want to come with us? I had thought perhaps things between us might have changed, said Shariah. You want me to, said Tercel. To what, go somewhere? That's the problem. You can't, can you? You and Ankildar could both be in Arameth, and you'll still be just as close as you are right now, so you might as well just stay here. Harrier turned to Shariah. My feelings haven't changed. You said you chose me for as long as it pleased Sand and Star to grant us. Of course, we thought that was only going to be about a fortnight. I won't hold you to it. Fool of a northerner, said Shariah. Bring the lanterns. It's nighttime. These stairs are dark. I think she likes you, Harrier, said Tercel. Shut up, said Harrier. I think you're talking about my wife. So that is how they resolve the Harrier and Shariah thing. And we have a couple pages left that we are going to read straight through. And oh my gosh, this was a really, really long thing. Warned you guys this was going to be a long one, though. But we are going to finish the entire book. With nothing more than 2 small lanterns to light their way, they had to be careful as they climbed, but neither Tercel or Harrier wanted to create cold fire or mage light to see by. Tercel couldn't tell whether this trip up the stairs seemed to take longer than the last one, because he didn't remember much of the last one. He didn't remember very much at all about the day from before the wonderful, horrible, ridiculous, glorious, terrifying moment when he had been reunited with Ankildar in the battle that had followed. Tercel had spoken to more than 24 of the men and women of the 100 today, and they had all given him the same answer. No matter how they reckoned the passage of time in breaths or heartbeats or the movement of shadows, from the moment the wall of Mage Shield had appeared around the Black Dogs to the moment it had vanished from around Aniran's entire army had been less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to change his life. His, Harrier's, Ankildar's, everyone who bonded to a dragon from this moment on, everyone who was bonded to a dragon right now. No dragon would ever have to die again, and if that wasn't enough, they had created an entirely new kind of magic, because he wasn't a wild mage any more than Harrier was a high mage, but through Ankildar, their magics had fused and blended. He suspected that soon there would be high mages everywhere again, bonding to dragons and wild mages or elven mages. The future would be filled with more magic than ever before, but at such a cost. They climb the steps a little bit more and finally get to the top where Saravase is still sitting. Harrier actually attempts to offer a dragon bond to Shariah, who says, no, 1 dragon in my tents is going to be plenty. But that isn't really what they're up at the top for. What they're up at the top for is Tercel turns to the lake and says, I wanted to talk to somebody. Turns to the lake and yells, You lied to me. You said if we brought Aniran here and a dragon bond mage sacrificed himself to you freely, that Aniran would be bound. Are you out of your mind? Harrier yelled. We just won. Do not taunt the great power at the edge of his Techuco, Tercel. I did not lie. Suddenly a man-shaped figure stood on the very edge of the platform, but it wasn't the form of the Fire Crown that Tercel knew. This shape was formed of fire itself, its identifiable shape nothing more than a courtesy for them. You said, Tercel began, and then stopped. It wasn't like having somebody, Harrier, yell shut up in his ear, but there wasn't any other way for him to think about what stopped him. Please, will you tell us why or what you did say? Said Harrier. Tercel had never heard Harrier sound so polite. One who was anointed by the new magic called to me, and I came, and these words I spoke to him upon the sand. If a dragon-bound mage gives up his life at my shrine entirely of his own free will, then shall Aniron be dealt with in a fashion pleasing to you. The Fire Crown said to them both, and one did, and so it was. Oh, Light, said Tercel in sudden realization. That wasn't a promise, that was a prophecy. He turned to Harrier. The 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 fire sprites, they had the gift of prophecy. They were known for it. And you just now decide to mention this, said Harrier. I didn't think it was important. I asked for help, and the Fire Crown said it would bind the Nyran. No, you said you could bind her. For as long as Tellen Chattel burned, not that you would. The Fire Crown inclined its head. Yeah, this is why we don't go summoning up great powers and making bargains with them, said Harrier. Come on, we're done. Say goodbye. Tercel could hear disgust in Harrier's voice. He just hoped that the Fire Crown couldn't. Thank you for your help, said Tercel. We're leaving soon, very soon. We aren't coming back. I'm sure the elves still know the terms of the treaty that they made with your people. We'll find out what it is and honor it. That is acceptable, said the Fire Crown. Tercel wasn't sure whether it stepped off the platform or just dissolved, but between one moment and the next, the man-shaped form of fire was gone. I can't believe you didn't know the difference between a promise and a prophecy, said Harrier. Even without the dragon bond, Tercel had learned a long time ago how to tell when Harrier was covering up worry for safety with a show of temper. Destroyed is better than bound, said Ankildar. And, as well I know, while one may invoke the ancient powers and even petition them, one may never compel them. All goes as the wild magic wills. Oh, don't mention the wild magic to me right now, said Harrier, pulling Tercel back towards the steps. The results are great, but I'm not happy with its methods. If the wild magic had wanted to finally pay off Vissy What's-Its mage price, it could have come up with a better method than starting a war. Trust Harrier to decide that the Fourth and Darkened War was entirely designed by the wild magic to annoy him, thought Tercel. Fine, said Tercel. There's a Tachuko right behind you, and I know you got your 3 books on you. Toss them in. Renounce the wild magic. He hadn't exactly meant it as a joke, but sometimes the only way you could get Harrier's attention was to say something so outrageous that it made him stop and think. To Tercel's alarm, Harrier actually seemed to be taking his suggestion seriously. What would happen to the bond if Harrier renounced the wild magic? But after a minute, Harrier smiled just a little. Somebody has to keep the two of you out of trouble. I figure it's probably going to take a night mage to do it. Come on, let's all get out of here before this thing explodes again or Saravase decides to push me in. And that is actually the very last sentence of the book. So there were a few loose ends that were left. And that is one thing that bothers me about the end of this is we don't exactly know what's going to happen with Saravase. I'm assuming that Tercel and Harrier are going to find her a mage somewhere. I do think it's kind of funny that Harrier offers a dragon bond to Shariah who is, as far as we know, not magical at all, which would make it really hard for her to accept a dragon bond. And I like that there is more wrap up in this than there was in the Obsidian trilogy, because the Obsidian trilogy, we didn't get to see what happened, at least not as much in the after with our characters. We did get to see that, we got the final farewell to Adalia and then discovering that she was reborn into the elves, which did make a very satisfying wrap up, but this one kind of felt like a good wrap up as well. And we finally got the explanation of what wild magic versus high magic versus demon magic actually is. Anyway, that is going to do it though. And I probably will continue doing book recap reviews. I have to figure out a slightly better way to do it, and we might slow down the pace so that I can be better at it. But once I figure that out, we will definitely do this again. Thank you so much for listening. I know that this isn't as good as reading an entire book, but hopefully you got at least all of the salient points. And thank you so much for letting me do this. If we do more recap reviews, I kind of would like to do my very favorite book series, which is it's by the author Kristen Britton, and it's the Green Rider series, but I really have to figure out the format because I don't want to mess that up. I love that series so much. It is such a good series. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. Sorry this was an hour and a half. Hopefully you guys made it through. Leave me a thumbs up if you did make it through. That does always make me smile. Consider subscribing if you are not already, because I'm gonna figure out this whole book recap review thing as we go forward. Hopefully I will continue getting better at it. But and you can always join me for Pride and Prejudice, which we probably will be finishing up fairly quickly now, because I will probably be doing that on a nightly basis rather than every other night. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you later.